Welcome back to Loom Keebs. Today we're very excited to do a test of the latest and greatest switch from Gateron, the Gateron North Pole. Gateron's really been knocking it out of the park lately with releases such as the Gateron CJ and the Gateron Oil King, which have been very well reviewed and have been immensely popular in our store. So we really want to see whether they have been able to continue this trend with their latest switch, the North Pole. And here it is. So these are the Gateron North Pole switches. We currently have 2 of the 4 versions. They have 4 different versions of the North Pole. This right here is the North Pole Yellow. This right here is the North Pole Red, which corresponds loosely to the Yellow and Gateron Red spring weights and in terms of the kind of feel that they're trying to go for. You will also notice that the Gateron Yellow, which is on my left hand, is a standard Amex style stem, whereas the Gateron Red is actually a box style, and that leads it to feel quite different and have some different characteristics compared to the North Pole Yellow. There's also 2 other versions which we have not gotten thus far. They're more for like the gamer style, it's kind of like the silver style switch, as well as the tactile. But currently, because we're testing linears, these are the ones that we have on hand. So first thing to note, they are fully transparent, so for all you RGB lovers out there, this might be the switch for you. As you may know, all the other switches like the tangerines with the orange housing does tend to affect the color of the RGB lights coming through, whereas this will let you stay true to your RGB lighting. This is also a competitor for the Aqua Kings. It's got a very similar material in terms of having polycarbonate housings and stems, and the stem itself is actually the material used on the Ink V2. So that's a kind of combination of their own materials. So it'll be very interesting to see whether this can match the level of smoothness with their latest switches, as well as deliver a nice sound signature. Back to the board. So as you can see here, we've installed a bunch of switches on this board, which we're gonna put some switch caps over and we're gonna do some testing. As for the board itself, this is a stock Owl Labs Mr. Suit board with all the foams, including a PE foam layer. So keep that in mind as you look at the comparison. Yes, PE foam does have a tendency of giving the switch a very PE type of sound. At the same time though, the differences between the switches will still come through, and that's really what we're looking at over here. So let's get right into it. Right, and the keycaps are back on. First impressions with the switch itself is that it's actually really hard to put these switches onto my Mr. Suit board. Now I'm using the FR4 plate, which is definitely a very flexible plate. With my other switches, I can kind of get away with putting them in and then lifting the plate to make sure that it locks into the switch itself. But with these, I think these are a new housing mold that Gateron's using. They are extremely tight when you put it into the plate itself, and for that reason, I wasn't able to put them in unless I used a plate support fork. So that's something to keep in mind. They are extremely tight when it comes to fitting onto your plate. The second thing that I noticed is that on the stem itself, they are also extremely tight when it comes to fitting of keycaps over these stems. It required quite a bit more force than the other switches. So if you've got keycaps which are slightly looser, you could use those with the keycaps. Otherwise, it's just a matter of putting them in. Doesn't really affect it functionally in any way. So now that they're back in, let's do some quick testing to see what they sound and feel like. As a reminder, the top row here are the stock switches, and on the row below is the lubed and film switches. Now I know there might be concerns around differences in sounds between the layers as well, but we've done some testing between the 2 and they sound identical. So to us, it made no difference, and if the differences are so minute anyways, the difference of lubing and not lubing it would overpower the differences between the rows anyways, and so we don't think that that's going to be a major issue. All right, so let's jump right into what the switches sound like. Okay, so this is what the Gateron North Pole Yellow sounds like. And this is what the Gateron North Pole Red sounds like. Yellow. Red. So in terms of feel, right off the bat, the yellow feels more of a, it's got a softer bottom out, whereas the red has a more kind of standard bottom out. The yellow feels more cushioned, and I can kind of hear it too, right? Like on the way down, it feels a bit more cushioned versus the yellow. The spring weight on the yellow also seems a bit stiffer than the red. Now that you've heard what the stock version sounds like, let's check out the lubed and filmed version. Now the red. Back to the yellow. And then the red. Now to compare the yellow between stock and lubed and filmed. Honestly, to my ears, extremely similar. I can barely make out the difference. I think there is a slight difference in terms of the timbre of the switch, but it's very minor. They sound very similar to my ears. Let me know what you think in the comments. One more time. Stock, lubed, and filmed. Sounds very, very similar. I think it sounds slightly smoother on the lubed and filmed version, and it also feels smoother. That being said, the stock version is incredibly smooth for a stock switch, which for polycarbonate, I'm quite surprised at how smooth it feels, because it's not exactly the most low friction coefficient material as compared to things like POM. Next one is the red, and let's compare that between the stock and lubed and filmed. Quite more of a difference for the red. I think the sound changes quite a bit for the lubed and filmed, especially near the bottom out. If you can hear it one more time, listen for the bottom out. And also the tonality also changes slightly. Between the yellow and the red, I would say the red's definitely the clackier one. And the yellow is a bit more kind of subdued versus the red. I'm hitting them at the same, with the same amount of energy. So yellow is more subdued. It sounds slightly more cushioned. It's got a slightly kind of deeper tone versus the red. Generally, both switches are incredibly smooth, both in stock and lubed and filmed form. There are some slight improvements for lubing and filming, but honestly, the stock form is very, very smooth already. Incredibly impressive, honestly, for the switches that Gateron has come up with lately. And if we do a quick comparison with some of the other top-end switches from Gateron, for example, we've got the Ink V2 over here. So let's take a quick look at Ink V2. I think the North Pole red sounds more like an Ink V2 in terms of the pitch, right? So if we do a quick comparison here, North Pole red's right here. North Pole red's this one right here, and Ink V2 is here. It's definitely a different pitch, but the yellow sounds even more different. I think the Ink V2 sounds brighter compared to the other, the North Poles, which is interesting because I've always thought of the Ink V2 as a very deep sounding switch. Let's do a quick comparison against the CJ in stock form. It's interesting, the subdued sound of the yellow North Pole is really not kind of replicated in any of the other switches. So the red sounds closer. So look at it, listen to our red again. And the CJ. And lastly, the red in the Oil King. The yellow sounds closer to the Oil King. It's a more subdued version of it, but it's got a similar tone. So that's the comparison with the Gateron switches. Overall thoughts on this, definitely really amazing switches in terms of the smoothness. As well as kind of how it feels. It feels really, really nice. I'm a big fan of how the yellow feels like, honestly. It's quite unique of a feeling in terms of, like, it's just ever so slightly cushioned, but not like a silent switch. So I'm not quite sure what they did to do this. The red definitely feels more like a normal switch, which surprises me, since I thought the box would feel more different. But yeah, it's quite nice. I quite like the yellow. And in terms of sound, obviously that's all preference, but it sounds very pleasing to the ear as well. It's not as loud as my other switches, right? Listen to that. It's more subdued. So if you like a slightly more subdued switch in terms of like volume, but still having a very nice tone, the yellow is a great choice. Right, versus the red, which is, I guess, in terms of volume, more similar to the other top-end switches, and it also feels very nice. So generally, highly recommended these two switches. It really depends on what you're looking for. In terms of the box style, the red, I don't notice any kind of functional differences. I actually think that the red wobbles slightly more than the yellow, which is interesting. You would think that the box style would give it a bit more stability, but just kind of playing with my fingers, it feels a bit looser. But it's still on par with kind of the other top-end Gateron offerings. So it's not wobbly by any means, just that the yellow, the North Pole yellow, seems to be slightly tighter than the red. So that's the North Pole in a nutshell. Quick summary, great switch. Looks really, really nice. A big fan of the transparent housing. If you're looking to do any RGB on your keyboard, this would be probably my recommended switch. And in terms of sound, it's the Gateron North Pole Yellow is a more subdued kind of sound versus the red. They both have nice tonality. It depends on what kind of pitch you're looking for, but they both sound very pleasing to my ears. In terms of feel, both are very, very smooth. The yellow has got a more cushioned feel to it versus the red. So it also kind of depends on what kind of feeling you're looking for, but to me, I really, really enjoyed how the yellow felt. On to the spectrum analysis. What we're seeing here is what is called a frequency spectrum. On the x-axis, which is a horizontal, you can see a frequency from 20 hertz all the way to 24 kilohertz. And on the y-axis is decibels, which is basically how loud it is. So what we're looking for here is really how high the peak is. So what we're looking for here is really what frequency of sound at which the switch peaks at. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch of the switch. The lower the frequency, the deeper sounding the switch would be, or in some other people's terms would be how thocky a switch would sound. Over here you can see that the yellow North Pole peaks at around 2000 hertz, whereas the red North Pole peaks at around 2.5 kilohertz. So the yellow version of the North Pole is going to sound slightly deeper than the red version, which matches what our experiences were, because the red sounds slightly more clackier than the yellow version of the North Pole. You can also see that the magnitude or volume of the North Pole red is higher than the North Pole yellow by how high the peaks are, and that also jives with what we saw in terms of the volume of the yellow version of the North Pole being slightly more muted. Now when we look at the lubed and filmed version of the yellow, you can see that it peaks at also around 2000 hertz. Pitch of the switch, it doesn't really change all that much between the lubed and filmed version and the stock version. You can, however, see that the shape of the curve is slightly different, and so the overall timbre of the sound might sound slightly different when you lube and film it. Similarly for the red, when you lube and film it, the peak of the sound is still at around 2.5 kilohertz, so that also does not change significantly. However, you can also see that the red lubed and filmed does seem to be more centralized and contained within the 1.6 to 3.2 kilohertz range. Now, when you compare the yellow North Pole stock versus the Oil King, you can see that the yellow North Pole actually has a deeper sound than even the Oil King. You can see the Oil King peaks at somewhere around 2.5 kilohertz, whereas the yellow stock peaks at around 2000 kilohertz. So it's actually a deeper sounding switch than even the Oil King, just looking from a frequency spectrum analysis perspective. Next, comparing the red stock versus the Oil King stock, they peak at around a similar range, but the red version of the switch of the North Pole does have a wider frequency range there, so there's other sounds added to it. But in terms of the general pitch of the sound, it seems like they would be in a similar range. Now, when you compare the yellow North Pole versus the Ink V2, the Ink V2 actually peaks at a lower frequency than the yellow North Pole. The Ink V2, it's at around 1.8 kilohertz versus the 2 kilohertz of the yellow, implying that Ink V2 is actually a deeper sounding switch than the yellow, but they are quite close. Next up, we have the red versus the Ink V2, and here you can see the North Pole red is indeed a higher pitch switch compared to the Ink V2. And next we have the yellow versus the CJ, and the CJ peaks at around 2.4 kilohertz, which is a slightly higher pitch than the yellow, but it's got a very different sound profile compared to the yellow switch. Lastly, we've got the CJ versus the North Pole red, and they peak at around a very similar range, right about 2.5 kilohertz. But as we said before, the Gateron North Pole red does have a wider range of frequencies, so there's other sounds being introduced. And so apart from the overall pitch of the switch, there's other types of sounds introduced into the switch, which can make it sound different compared to the CJ. So that's kind of a quick analysis of the sound spectrum of the Gateron North Pole red and yellow. And just from the looks of the charts, it looks like the Gateron North Pole yellow is going to be quite a deep sounding switch, which matches what we have seen, apart from it being kind of like a deep muted sound that we've seen from our practical tests. Whereas the red is closer in terms of pitch to your other high-end Gateron switches like the Oil King and the CJ. So this is the brand new switch from Gateron. Very impressed with the latest offerings, honestly. They've been on a run, and this latest switch is no different. So let us know what you think of the switch, and let us know what you thought of this video as well. If you thought that this was interesting, please do subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate that. And we're going to do more testing in the future, especially testing this on other boards as well. I know a lot of you have been asking about, oh, what does it sound like on a board without PE foam, for example. We've got a couple more boards coming in, so we'll be doing testing on that as well. But any type of likes or subscribing would be greatly appreciated. If you're interested in how the other switches sound, for example, the tangerines, banana splits, or the KTT strawberry, we've got another video in our channel where we've already done testing on that, so take a quick look at that as well if you're interested. Both videos are recorded using the same SM7B Shure microphone to make sure that you guys get the best possible sound quality and can be easily compared against each other. Happy keyboarding! I'll see you next time.